All right, so you have completed units 1 and our little mini unit number 2, and we're on to unit 3, a new nation. What comes next? What does America do now that it's newly independent? Now, as you can imagine, when you're forming a new government, the first thing you need to do is decide how it's going to function, who's in charge, what are they allowed to do, what are they not allowed to do. This is really the backbone of a new country. And you're probably very familiar with the Constitution, or you should be, but the Constitution was not America's first governing document. It was in fact a document called the Articles of Confederation. It was like a first draft of a rule book for how America would work. Now, the goals when writing the Articles of Confederation are to establish a permanent living document. Living meaning it can be changed, it can be added to. There needs to be a structure of government. In our case, we know that we now have the bicameral legislature and 3 branches of government. This is a structural decision that had to be made, and it took some time to figure it out. Roles need to be delineated, positions of authority need to be created, and power needs to be balanced. So where did inspiration come from for producing the Articles of Confederation? Where it actually came from the state of Virginia. George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights provides a lot of influence over what will later become the Bill of Rights, and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, written by Thomas Jefferson, also influences the idea that you can have a country where religion is not inextricably linked to politics. Now, the most important word that we need to think of when we think about producing the Articles of Confederation is the idea of compromise, a huge compromise between interests of big states and small states, rural and urban states. So when we think about compromise, a lot of times compromises result in neither party really getting exactly what they want, and that's what happens with the Articles. There are 2 interpretations of how America's government should be run. And if you look at these lists, you can sort of see the origins for what will later become our 2 major political parties. So on the one hand, we have Federalists. Federalists support a strong federal or central government that has a lot of power and influence over the individual states. They support a central bank, a central treasury, and their members included people like George Washington, James Madison, and John Adams. On the other hand, the anti-federalists advocated for more power in the hands of individual states, letting individual states have more decision-making, make choices that are unique to the needs of their own people, limited federal power, and their proponents are people like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Mason. So ultimately, 2 proposals are drawn up, a New Jersey plan and a Virginia plan. Now, New Jersey is a small state. It's primarily being used for shipping and trading. Virginia, on the other hand, is really, really big. It's the oldest permanent colony, so it has a larger population, and they have a lot of land area. So representatives from New Jersey write what's called the Patterson Plan. And the Patterson Plan says that congressional representatives will be given an equal number. So every state is going to have an equal number of members of Congress. Maybe that's 2, 4, whatever it is, but they're all going to have the same number of congressmen. Virginians, however, propose that the number of representatives in Congress will be determined by the population of the state, how many people are living in it. So what that means is that if the Virginia plan was in place, all of the bigger states would always win the votes in Congress because they would have far more people who could vote. Now, one of the most important first decisions that's made in the formation of our new government is the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise creates what we have now in our legislative branch of government. We have a Senate and a House of Representatives. And you can see that the House of Representatives looks a lot like the Virginia plan, where each state is given a proportional amount of representatives. Our Senate looks a lot like the New Jersey plan or the Patterson plan. Each state has 2 senators. So having those 2 houses in the legislature allows for the interests of both states, small and large, to be heard. Another compromise that is significant to the history of early America, but one that we all, that historians all recognize was a really inhumane decision, was the decision to count enslaved people living here in the colonists who were not granted citizenship, which is why I don't refer to them as Americans at the time, were counted in what's called the 3/5 compromise. So enslaved persons were part of the census that would be used to determine how many representatives each state got in the House of Representatives. Now, larger slave states, even though they didn't want to pay their slaves or give them citizenship, did want their slaves to be counted because that would mean they'd have a larger population and more representatives. Smaller northern states that had far fewer slaves did not want slaves to be counted at all in the census and argued that you cannot use a slave to gain representation in government if you don't also afford them rights of human beings. And the compromise, the rather ugly compromise they arrive at, is the 3/5 compromise, that in the census, a slave will essentially be counted as 3/5 of a person for taxation and population purposes. Now, the compromising continues during the ratification process. The Articles are originally adopted in November of 1777, but then they go through a ratification process, which is like an approval process, where it's assessed and evaluated, and that begins in March of 1781. This document remains our governing document from 1781 to 1787, at which point the obvious problems with the Articles need to be edited, and that's when the Constitution is initially begun. So you're going to get a handout on the Articles of Confederation to see what exactly went wrong in that document. You can answer that with a partner and answer them right on the handout. So ultimately, after you've done this reading, you should be aware of the problems with the Articles of Confederation, but let's talk about a few of those failures. If you look at this chart here, you can see a number of weaknesses. Congress could not levy taxes. They could not regulate foreign trade. Congress could not enforce the law. There's no system of enforcement. 9 states had to approve a law in order to enact it. 13 states had to approve amendments to the Articles. The government had no executive branch, and there's no national court system. So all of this results in an extremely ineffective government, a government that is slow to create change, a government that also is not very unified because individual states are sort of able to go off on their own and govern themselves extremely independently. So these are all reasons why ultimately the Articles of Confederation were abandoned. So when we talk, now we're going to start talking about the Constitution and how the Constitution was produced. And when you think about the Constitution, I know this probably isn't all fitting in the frame, but if you're familiar with the First Amendment rights, so it says the First Amendment guarantees freedoms concerning religion, expression, assembly, and the right to petition. It forbids Congress from promoting one religion over others and also restricting an individual religious practice. It guarantees freedom of expression by prohibiting Congress from restricting the press or the rights of individuals to speak freely, and guarantees the rights of citizens to assemble peaceably and petition their government. So I want you to take a moment to just think, what do you think is your most important First Amendment right? Let's take a closer look inside the Constitution now. There are really 6 big ideas that are found inside the Constitution. And a lot of those big ideas come from trial and error. Having the Articles of Confederation in place for a decade gave the government an opportunity to discover where were its weaknesses, where were its strengths, what was missing, what needed to be more specific. And so the Constitution comes out of that system of trial and error. We're going to go through each of these 6 big ideas, and these really are, they're not in any particular order, but they are 6 principles of the Constitution that are important to know. So the first big idea is the idea of limited government, really meaning that the government is not going to have complete all-encompassing power over its citizens, that the Constitution is designed to protect the rights of people, not to give the rights of people. Because we're still coming out of that Enlightenment idea that natural rights are due, not given. The Bill of Rights is probably the best example of how limited government exists in the Constitution, because the Bill of Rights is stating things that are not privileges offered by the government, but requirements that the government must uphold. The second big idea is the idea of republicanism. Now, this doesn't mean Republican like Republican Party, but Republican like the Roman Republic and the structure of government. A lot of times you hear people refer to American democracy in a very general way, but if we're going to be specific about the form of government we actually have, we do not have a pure Athenian democracy, which is rule by the people where every single person votes on every single issue. Instead, we have what's closer to a republic. We have rule by representatives, and more specifically, a democratic republic where the people vote for their representatives, and the representatives then vote in the interest, ideally, of the people. Our third big idea is federalism, the notion that we don't have individual governments for every state without having one big umbrella government, one big federal government overseeing the powers of the state governments. The fourth big idea is the idea of checks and balances. Now, you might remember the 3-ring circus video from Schoolhouse Rock if you ever watched that as a kid. We designed our structure of government to have 3 branches because that way each one can balance the other. So the legislative branch writes laws. They propose ideas, propose changes and innovations to better make the country run more effectively, more efficiently. Those ideas can be are enforced by the executive branch. The executive branch is large. There are many, many different cabinets that attend to many, many different issues. The same goes for the legislative branch. Within the Senate, within the House of Representatives, are countless committees that focus on lots and lots of specialty areas. And those have all been developed over time as we have learned what those greatest areas of concern are. So the legislative branch is writing the laws. The executive branch is enforcing the laws, overseeing any way that the laws could actually be carried out. And the judicial branch is approving the laws. The judicial branch actually has the final decision as to whether a law is constitutional. So Congress can propose a law. The president can actually propose an executive order, but ultimately any decisions that affect our legal system have to be approved for their constitutionality by the judicial branch. Another really critical principle, and I just described it a bit there, is the idea of separation of powers. So we have checks and balances where we make sure that no one branch of government can have a monopoly over decision making. We also have a separation of powers and give different responsibilities to different branches so that they have a unique role that is protected and no one else has the power to do it. The sixth important principle is popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty really is the idea that the people, the populace, should have influence and control over the governance of their country. Now, we might relinquish some of that control to representatives that we elect, but still, those are people who are elected, who can be voted back into office, or who can be voted out of office. And that's because sovereignty, ultimate rule, is in the hands of the people. And the most significant way that the people express that popular sovereignty is in exercising their right to vote.